So let's kick off today's session with, looking at learning outcome 5. And this basically talks about, how do we look at reviewing people and how they are managed within the organization. So I've got a few slides that I want to go through. But apart from that, what I'm going to try and do is go through one or two handouts, which will cover some of these, individual topics, things like CSR in particular. And then we'll look at a topic in terms of individual and team building and how does that happen within organization. And in the last, what we look at, one of the key things that we will study would be how organizations review employee performance, and that will be through the route of, staff appraisals or employee appraisals. So stop me where you have any questions or any queries, and what I will do is I will try my level best to answer, and then towards the end of the session, I will summarize, and then we'll send you some specific handouts which cover, tasks 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3. So let's look at the first one here. I think key concepts that we want to understand is, as you know, that a lot of people nowadays work within organizations. Now, every company has some goals and objectives which are set by the board, or maybe if it's a small organization like a small business with up to 10 employees, maybe the managing director or the director of the company, CEO of the company sets across some goals, which could be in terms of targets. It could be qualitative or quantitative goals. And these goals towards the end of every month, maybe in some cases end of quarter, or in some cases 6 monthly or yearly, are measured. Now, these measurement, of goals, which are primarily set in terms of a business plan, or in terms of a vision document, in terms of a document which normally the senior person would produce, be given across to different employees within the department. Now, they all have a common thread, which is the overarching objective of achieving, say, for example, the main aim which the organization is set. Now, if I look at just a simple example of bringing in NHS in this context, just to understand from that health and social care concept. Now, Jeremy Hunt, which is the health secretary, he has now been positioning the concept of that the A&E, accidents and emergencies time in terms of wait times should be brought under 2 hours. So no patient or no individual coming into the A&E department should be waiting for more than 2 hours. Now, what he is specifying in that is basically some sort of a target which he wants to set within the NHS, that if people end up calling A&E or, calling the emergency services 999, then in that case, if you end up using this particular service, your wait time should not be more than 2 hours. So they want to bring it down to under 2 hours. And at this stage, the wait timings, I think the last study that was done by BBC came out at this stage, the wait times in some of the hospitals and trusts is in excess of 4 hours, which means that the patient actually have to wait on the in the ambulances or in the corridors on the beds before they are actually seen by the relevant staff to look at the problem. So this particular objective that he's trying to set as the highest official in the government, in being a health secretary, is like he's trying to set some sort of a target, and this target is then broken down or kind of interpreted into smaller targets, which are then taken up by hospitals and trusts across England and Wales. And this is where what they do is, in order to achieve this overarching objective, what they look at is they break it down to understand what are the factors which actually contribute to the waiting times being more than 2 hours. And those objectives, factors, are then translated into meaningful objectives, and they are then given to different departments to be able to minimize or reduce the time there, thereby overall reducing the wait time for 2 hours, or bring it down under 2 hours. So the common thread that he, let's put it this way, the overarching objective that he's trying to set in this case is the waiting time to be brought under 2 hours. And this, being a common thread, is taken up by various trusts to understand what factors contribute to increase in the wait times. And those factors are then given out as targets to various departments which are involved in this particular operation to try and see if they can reduce the times and thereby overall reducing the wait times. Another example, just to explain this, would be that sometimes setting an objective with a specific timeline is important. That means I know that he's been setting this as an objective, and he's set a lot of other objectives within the health and within the NHS in particular in the last 4 to 5 years. The reason why he's been setting this objective is that these objectives, some of the objectives are interrelated. So the wait times in A&E could also be related to why the doctors are not able to take on patients once they arrive into the hospital, and that could mean that there is shortage of beds, or there could be other reasons like shortage of staff and things like that. And all these factors actually then at some stage play into each other, and because of which one of the outcomes is that the wait times is not increasing but increasing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, if I have to give you a different example, would be that let's look at a small organization wherein the director of the company or the MD of the company sets a sales target, and he wants to achieve, say, £1 million in terms of turnover by selling some of the products and services that they produce. Now, what that would mean is somebody within the organization, assuming if they have 2 or 3 departments like the finance department, sales and marketing, and maybe a person managing HR, what they will then do is they will identify people which will carry this target directly. So they will be people in predominantly business development, sales organizations, and they will have the direct target of ensuring that this particular sales target is met. Now, when they break it down basis, if there are 5 sales managers, they break it down basis the region in which they operate and what is the potential in that region to be able to contribute to helping the person achieve it. Now, if I look at the London area, maybe the person working in that area might need to be given a higher target because that is a bigger market. If somebody is working in Northeast, Northwest, Midlands, or even in Scotland, then obviously the sales, they're all in the same team, but their target might vary because of the type of market they kind of handle. So what happens at this stage is if the MD sets a target of say 1 million and it has to be then broken down into individual targets, then this is done in general by either the department manager or the line manager, or in some cases, if it's a small organization, it is done by the HR manager sitting in tandem with the managing director. Now, the reason of doing this is they have to set realistic targets which basically allow the individual to achieve them, but also allow individual to perform and at the same stage, be motivated enough to go after those targets for achieving them. So if I look at this particular slide, which I have on the screen, so what the company strategy here would be to achieve a sales target of say 1 million, which could be say also translated into increasing over the previous year by 50%. So that means if they achieve 750,000 last year, they are looking at a 50% or 25% increase, and that would be $1 million. So this strategy is then broken down into individual team objectives. So team objectives here will be things like the sales targets predominantly 1 million could be a combination of sales, service, and some of the other income which is coming into the company. So here, those targets will be individually then allocated to teams. So 1 million, for example, in terms of turnover, might be broken down into sales for 750K, maybe services for 200K, and then the balance 50K coming in from other sides or other contributions coming in from other departments, which also earn a bit of revenue. So here, defining individual targets then leads to allocation of individual targets. So the sales team has been given 750K, but if there are 5 sales managers, then you allocate individual targets depending on the region that they are in. And once that is done, because it's an organization wherein it needs to be reviewed, and this is the important driver in terms of driving sales or profits for the company, the appraisals are done monthly in this case. And once the monthly appraisals are done, the reason of doing monthly appraisals would be to try and pick up on gap areas wherein that would mean the performance is lacking or the person is achieving the target. In some cases, it might require other When I say other inputs, it could be sometimes sales or promotions are required, advertising is required. So that is put into place as enablements for the person to be able to achieve the target. This then leads to something called annual appraisal, which will come into a bit, and then the whole team's appraisal towards the end of the year. That means at some stage, individuals achieve their own target, but they then form a part of a bigger team, and as a result, the whole team needs to achieve the target for the company to achieve its objective. So this then becomes something called a performance management cycle. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Now, most companies nowadays look at, defining or giving targets using something called SMART goals. Now, SMART basically is an acronym which stands for, targets being very specific. They need to be measurable. They should also be achievable. They should be relevant, and then they should be time bound. Now, this is a particular technique which normally most managers use within a position wherein they manage a few, staff or employees. And the idea there is that you give them goals or you give them objectives which can be classified across these 5 categories. And to a certain extent, they need to be stretched, but to an extent that they should be achievable. So if I have to look at sometimes even in personal and professional life, when you set targets for yourself or when you set targets within teams, most managers would look at using this as a technique to set the targets. And the idea here is they have to nowadays be realistic in terms of setting what is achievable. It can't be that the target set is not kind of achievable, and that would lead to demotivation or negativity from a point of view of the employee working within the organization. Now, it is easier for managers or line managers to kind of tweak these targets, because if they see that the persons are achieving the target well, then to a certain extent they can increase the specific target for an individual and add some bonus or incentive, additional incentives to the target, so that if you achieve more, you're able to earn more. So we do see this concept of something called circa. That means something in the region of. Sometimes when you see some vacancies being advertised predominantly in the business development, sales, marketing area, you will see that their salary packages advertised on most job portals normally at some stage would say a base salary of this, but a circa, which means achievable, or you could look at bonus incentives and perks all included. The package would be in that region. Now, in some cases, they say that realistically you will be able to achieve up to 10 to 12K, but in some cases they say it is uncapped bonus. That means if you sell more, if you kind of are able to achieve or take aggressive targets, you are able to achieve more incentives or a higher bonus structure as compared to some of the other employees with organization. You get to see this as an example mostly in financial services, in banking services, where sometimes banking in particular, investment banking in particular, are exceptionally high, because the stakes in those when individuals work within the organization and take up certain targets, the stakes are quite high, and if they're able to achieve it or manage it, their incentive and bonus structures are also unexpectedly high. Now, in terms of understanding how this is set is something that we need to also get into. And a simple example would be when you do your, say, a particular task. So here the idea would be to try and include a table, and that table would basically say what does SMART mean. So obviously you write out specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. But the idea would be to take an example here to explain how SMART targets could be set. So in the case of, say, schools, you will see most teachers actually set SMART targets for students. So if they feel in a class, obviously there are, what they do is they put some sort of a traffic light system like amber, red, and green. And what most teachers and tutors typically do is they work with these SMART targets of moving a group of students from red to amber and amber to green to try and achieve an overall pass percentage, or an overall percentage wherein everybody within that academic year actually progresses to the next year, and rather than somebody staying behind. So in primary and secondary school, most teachers would use SMART targets, and the targets which they put is, if they find somebody is weak in English or maths, what they will tend to do is give out specific homework or practice exercises which then can lead on to some sort of a measurable activity. So a simple example that I would give out is, sometimes you will see some students or children are weak with numbers. So what they do is they give them specific exercises which are primarily to get them used to with these numbers. Now the measurement comes in when they progressively start increasing the scale at which the complexity of numbers or number-based exercises is done. So maybe it could start off with counting, but at some stage it leads into something called learning the tables. So that activity might have 3-4 steps, and from being specific, they are increasing complexity to try and make it measurable. But because the student or the child is able to achieve every level, it keeps the child motivated, keeps him achieving that particular level, and pushes him slowly and steadily forward towards achieving higher levels to get into a particular say green group, or from amber move to green, or from red move to amber. And these tasks are relevant because they are specific for that class or year, and they are designed over the years by teachers, so they know that these are very specific and they are workable, and they are relevant to these exercises are relevant to the fact that it is helping the child improve his or her understanding of numbers. Now sometimes you will see some activities, not sometimes, you will see most activities in the schools are timed. That means what they want to be able to do is they need to move children who are in the A particular group, say amber group, into green within 2 to 3 weeks, or 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the time frame which is set. And the reason why it is timed is that if they do feel that this is not happening, then relevant people have to be kind of spoken to, or have to be made aware of that the case wherein this particular problem is being faced. So timing is important because sometimes it helps to flag off issues, and also helps determine gap areas which cannot be covered. And in some cases, the timing is also required because it helps put a perspective in terms of the overall goal and objective. So if the child studies in a particular year for one academic year, it can't be that they can achieve what they want to achieve in 2 years, because every year they have to move up a class. So if it's an organization, sales targets are across a year, it can't be 2 yearly target or 3 yearly targets. So obviously measurements, salaries, bonus, incentives are all payable on an annual basis. So obviously timing on that aspect is important. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Now let's look at 1 or 2 slides to understand, staff appraisals. Now there are lots of ways and means through which people in the managerial position which manage staff look at appraisals, or look at getting updates on activities which are given out. Now, a simple example that we do get to see, but we do not sometimes realize that it also kind of contributes to measuring performance, is maybe a staff meeting. Now, most companies, most places that you work in today, they do monthly meetings or weekly meetings. Now, the idea of doing those meetings is that the person heading that meeting, or the person heading the department, wants to get an update in terms of where they are with regards to the work being done, or the goal being accomplished. And sometimes you will see that these meetings have very clear agendas, and the idea of having these clear agendas is that they want to get updates. The management in particular wants to get updates, and these updates are important because this makes them aware, or this gives them the opportunity to apprise themselves of what is actually happening with regards to the targets, or the jobs or objectives being given. Now, these meetings also look at bringing up things which are primarily going to be issues. So problems and issues are also discussed, difficulties being faced in terms of achieving those targets, and sometimes managers here get hold of these difficulties or areas of problem areas, and in general then look at giving further solutions so that the overall objective is met. Now, in the case of NHS, you will see that most of these meetings tend to happen on a daily basis, which is a daily brief, and the daily brief tends to happen when the shift or a transition is happening, say for example 8-hour shifts, because this particular department works 24/7. So when you have people leaving the shift and the new shift starting, see a proper handing taking over happening. And the reason why this proper handing taking over happens is to understand the medicines being administered to a certain number of patients, or tests are pending and things like that. And here, the difficulty or the problem areas when the shift happens are clearly flagged across, because it leads to life and death situations. So in this case, it is the responsibility of the professional, the nurse or the doctor, to kind of make the person coming in to take over for the next shift, to make them aware that these are areas which need to be looked into almost on an immediate basis to avoid any complications. Now, sometimes you will see that these meetings happen on a weekly basis, and the idea of having these meetings starting on a working week, which is a Monday, or towards the end on a Friday, is to basically look at understanding the work which has been accomplished, what could be the major goals or areas for which the work required needs to commence next week. And to a certain extent, also some of these meetings celebrate the accomplishments which have happened. So for example, if something has been achieved, or if something in a major breakthrough has happened, or maybe from a point of view of sales targets, assuming easier to explain, and the example would be that maybe they won a big order, or something which was being pursued for a long time has actually come through. Maybe a patient who's been having difficulties recovering has finally recovered, has moved from ICU to a particular has come out of the ICU. Those are things which are also celebrated in these meetings. Now, these meetings tend to be documented. The reason of having documentation done is that they want to kind of capture the individual contributions which have been made towards the objectives. So you will normally see managers making some notes, or within these meetings, sometimes you will see there is a minute taker, or a person who normally minutes the meeting and is then circulating the minutes of the meeting to everyone who is either attended or has not been able to attend. In some cases, apologies because they were work or they were involved in work and things like that. And this is a very simplistic exercise of looking at performance appraisal. This happens at a formal, informal level in every department, in every organization. And these minutes of the meetings, are the simplest form of appraisals which can be done by a manager to understand what is the current situation, in terms of achievement towards or working towards the goals and objectives. So these meetings sometimes have participation from all the employees. If the line managers call the meeting, sometimes some of them are not able to attend, and those who are not able to attend are then sent the minutes of the meeting on the email, or when they come in for the next meeting, they need to go through the minutes of the meeting to apprise themselves of what is actually discussed or happened in the last meeting, and then they contribute towards the new one when they are attending. Now, the other bit that we look at is primarily understanding what are appraisals. Now, why appraisals are required in organizations, and how they look at measuring, the operational performance of an organization, and that is an individual contribution of all the employees who work within the department organization put together to look at an annual, target being achieved, not being achieved for an organization. Now, appraisals typically look at accomplishing three things. One is they look at understanding the, let's put it this way, three things. First is they look at understanding what the person has been able to achieve. And if the target was given, how much of that target set has been achieved. The second thing which the appraisal ends up understanding and achieving is the areas in which the employee actually needs training and development. What were the reasons because of which the targets or goals were not met? And those are gap areas which are picked up in the appraisal. And those gap areas come across because the employees would end up talking about issues or problems that they faced throughout the year in terms of working towards the objective. And because these targets were not met because of certain problems or issues, those are then addressed and written down and noted down in terms of gap areas on which training and development is then put as a plan, as a corrective action plan for those employees. The third thing it does is it looks at past performance. That means the year gone past, or the 6 monthly, whether they are 3 monthly, 6 monthly, quarterly, 6 monthly, or annually. But in most cases, we are looking at appraisal as an activity. The third thing it does look at so it looks at last year's performance and the gap areas, but it also then sets a tone in terms of what will be given out as targets and agreement on those targets for the next 12 months. So this is an activity which just not looks at the previous achievement of the previous year and what you were able to achieve, but also then looks at setting appropriate targets and goals with regards to what you achieved last year for the next 12 months. Now, this process typically in most organizations is done through formal reviews, and this formal reviews typically tend to happen with your line manager. They tend to happen with the HR being present, and also involved in some cases, surveys or questionnaires which the employees asked to fill beforehand. Now, this is going to lead into something that we will cover off in another unit called personal and professional development, wherein most employees within organizations are asked to develop something called a personal development plan, or a plan which basically identifies the areas in which they would need to, develop skills, and those skills, when developed, would help them do their job or achieve their objectives in a better way and cover those gap areas. Now, in some cases, you will see that when the performance appraisal is done, some organizations end up sending a template of their performance appraisal, something called self-appraisal. And that self-appraisal you need to fill in, which is a set of questions, and they want to understand what were the things which went well, what were the things which did not go well, what were the areas in which you received support, areas in which you want to get support to be able to achieve those targets better. So that self-appraisal as an activity is also asked to be completed, and once that is completed, then you sit down and you go through this formal process of something called appraisals. And then towards the end, once the appraisal is done, they come to some sort of a summary or a summary report, and that then is shared with the employee, the line manager, and a record of that report is actually kept into the employee or the staff file for future references. Now, have you, in terms of your previous work, have you gone through any sort of appraisal which has happened within the organization with regards to yourself and your role?
Yeah, I have with my area managers. Yeah, I've been through appraisals before. They were just going through the same thing, really, talking about targets, why they weren't achieved, or, I was appraised if they were achieved, and just things like that.
Sure. So in terms, do you recall if there were any specific, say, for example, were you asked to do a self-appraisal first? Were you asked to fill up a questionnaire, like a 360-degree review or a feedback? Was anything in terms of any such exercises done?
Yeah, we were given questionnaires to fill out about how we felt about, the targets that were set in place.
Right.
They asked us some questions about how we felt first, and then the manager would go through it with us in the meeting.
Right. Okay, that's fine. And you typically, I don't know whether this is something which you have come across, but typically once the appraisal is done, most organizations also send across some sort of a survey for you to complete, that they want to find out if the appraisal was a fair process, and, were you happy with the way it was conducted, and to a certain extent, what were the areas that they want to get some feedback on, are the areas which were not addressed. So did you end up having some sort of a, survey from SurveyMonkey, or, some sort of a survey to complete after the appraisal activity happened?
No, I don't remember.
Right. Okay. So in some cases, what tends to happen is because of the employment legislation, which is now the Employment Act, which has come in, I think it was 1999. Sometimes you do get to see that employees, if they do not have a good appraisal, or if they've not met the targets, they end up being dismissed by the organization. So they go through the process of something called an exit interview before an employee is dismissed, or they're asked to, if they are to be replaced by making them redundant. So because of the employment legislation which has come in, some organizations wherein they go through this process, and what they want to be able to do is towards the end, they want to capture whether the whole process was fair enough, was carried out in a manner which was fair to the employee and to the organization. Most HR departments are now obligated to do an exit interview process. And in some cases, even after the activity is done, even if the employee is not leaving or whatever, they still end up doing some sort of a brief survey to understand if the process which they went through in terms of capturing, the key, or let's put it this way, capturing significant, achievements and gap areas is basically then captured through the process of, doing some sort of a feedback survey, or in some cases, if employees are leaving, through an exit interview process. Now, some of these things are very clearly documented within the employee handbook when you join the organization. So most organizations that today we join or we work within have something called a staff handbook or an employee handbook. And what they tend to do is they tend to kind of clearly highlight the policies and procedures which most of the members have to follow when you work within these, when you work within a particular role in a company. And these are done because of the Employment Act coming in, wherein some of these things should be then provided to the new staff so that they are aware that there is going to be a review, or they are going to be measured or benchmarked against a particular practice or a set of procedures which has already been set in the organization. So typically you will see that sometimes within organization, a lot of people who are in a job wherein they have to travel quite a lot, they tend to refer to something called a expense claiming procedure, which is to claim conveyance or travel allowance and things like that when they travel on business reasons. So sometimes these policies and procedures are carefully highlighted within the employee handbook. Now, there are other things which are also put in. For example, when we look at certain procedures which kind of highlight how you need to do or what you need to do if you're faced with this particular situation. Now, most organizations in the global, when I look at global organizations, and in today's time, they have something called an employee intranet. Now, that is a portal through which employees can actually access all the policies. Say it could be a policy on appraisal, it could be a policy on discrimination, harassment, it could be a policy related to expenses, it could be a policy related to how your appraisal would happen, quality policies, or anything to look at, sickness policy, sickness pay. These things are now, some organizations have digitized their processes. So what they do is they have an intranet and the employees have access to it. And in some cases you get an email which is basically more or less an employee handbook, which has all these procedures in it, so that it does not come up as a surprise to the individual when you work within a particular role, and you are able to follow the set of guidelines which have been laid out by the organization when you, in some cases, represent the organization, who is going to be the public speaker, or people who can actually address the press. And these kind of things are clearly then highlighted within the handbook. And the reason why this is done is that at any given stage, most organizations which have gone through a particular process and have become, let's put it this way, not startup businesses, but have been operating for a number of years, then tend to have these procedures in place which help employees conform with most of the, basically help them conform with most of the, practices which the organization wants the employee to adhere to or, observe while they're working for the organization. Now, if I look at, for example, sometimes, if you're new to a company and you're joined and you're facing your first performance appraisal, you will tend to have many questions in terms of how the process will happen, how long does it take, what is the outcome of that process, and in some cases, who's going to sit in my appraisal? Is it going to be my peers, my colleagues, or, in some organizations, they look at, when you look at engineering, production, you look at, services-oriented organizations. Most organizations also collect something called a 360-degree feedback, or they do a 360-degree appraisal. That means because of the position that you work in, it is not just important for them to kind of look at, doing an appraisal, in your case, not just by your managers, but they need to see how you work with or within teams. So they look at some sort of feedback from your colleagues, and in some cases they also look at feedback from your peers, people who you manage directly, and then you have responsibility in terms of supervisory responsibility to be able to manage them. Now, in some cases, you will see that these policies also look at these policies and procedures which are related to appraisal also impact, work planning. Now, a simple example that I would give here is that sometimes you will get to see that if a person is being, a person is going through the process of appraisal, say maybe a yearly appraisal, what they do tend to see is that their job requirement requires flexible working. Now, the idea of having this table is when the appraisal happens, it is more or less a discussion which follows a particular format, and that's predefined in the employee handbook in terms of what are the things they will go through when they look at doing an appraisal. So everything related to the appraisal is linked into the company objective, and also it is linked into the kind of incentives and the perks that you get when you work at a particular position within the organization. So in some cases, when I said earlier that employment legislation makes it important for companies to also put these procedures in place, is that an example here would be the case in point of national holidays. So most companies have to then provide an holiday calendar or where leave cases, they have some sort of a software in place which allows them to have employees participate, put in their key times in which they want to avail those holidays. It could be things which are related to, say, paternity leave. It could be things which are related to sickness leave, and those are things which are appropriately captured in the performance appraisal. Now, the reason that I mentioned this, it is done, is because most organizations today look at working towards the overall objective, which is fine, but in general they look at the productivity from a particular department, from a particular employee, how productive you are in terms of accomplishing that job, how soon can you do it, and do you require any supervision, are you able to work independently, and those kind of things are also then captured in the performance appraisal. Now, sometimes you will see that in some organizations there is flexibility given to people to work. That means in terms of office timings, there's a bit of flexibility given, because they generally feel that as long as the employee is achieving the task, time and relevance of time does not matter, because at the end of the day, the tasks are being achieved. So when you look at people who are in the front desk services, or somebody which are customer facing, their time management is very important, because if the office does not open on time, or if the call is not picked up on time, you see there's a journal, that would basically mean that the service level agreements, for example, in the case of when you call emergencies and you do not have a ring being picked up in 4 rings, that means it could lead to it could basically lead to somebody not being let's put it this way, life being put at risk. So when you call the 999 line, you expect that it is picked up immediately and you get a response pretty much instantly. But in those cases, if the telephone system breaks down, or if it's not picked up in a certain number of rings, that could mean that it could put potential lives at risk, or people at risk. So in those cases, you will see there is very less flexibility, and staff which work within those roles have to be 100% compliant with policies and procedures which are set in the staff handbook. But there are other organizations wherein you will see wherein flexibility is allowed, because as long as the task is met and the task being done is critical, but not critical from a point of view of life-threatening critical. So when you look at engineering organizations, a lot of people work on a particular code within Google, Facebook, and like these kind of organizations. You will see that engineers are given the flexibility to be able to work in terms of the number of hours they want to work, as long as the task is done. So these kind of things are also captured, because what I'm trying to say is that the organizations today, because of the nature of the work and the nature of jobs which are involved, the HR department in the performance appraisal as an activity tries to capture areas which make employees more productive. That means giving certain flexibilities would mean, in terms of work timings, in terms of journal upkeep or attendance within the office, they would help move productivity higher. They would help keep employees motivated. This would help keep employees loyal to the organization. And those are key qualitative factors which are also picked up in the performance appraisal. And these questions are very specific because they then tend to relate to, going back to the Maslow's hierarchy of need, they then tend to relate to different types of needs which different individuals have within the organization. Now, if I look at somebody when going through a performance appraisal and at a very senior position, then when I say senior position, maybe at the management position or board level position, there the most important factor for them is they are looking at actually self-actualization, because they've gone through a stage wherein they are quite stable within the job. They have most of the things which are required in terms of safety needs as we look at. So they are also quite satisfied and settled in their life because they tend to be in their mid-40s, mid-50s. And in terms of responsibility, they have a very high sense of responsibility within the organization. So at their level, when the reviews happen, they tend to kind of capture a lot of other things. But one of the key things they look at capturing in that review is how ambitious the individual is, how is the growth of the individual important in the overall context, and which factors are important for the individual to remain within the organization, whether that is going to be growth in terms of pay package, whether it will be growth in terms of responsibility, whether it will be growth in terms of the title, in terms of the actual title, literal title that the person occupies, or is that going to be enough? Are these factors going to be enough for them to be able to retain that individual within the organization? So if I look at somebody who's joined the company maybe and has just completed a year, has gone through you will typically tend to see that these individuals have needs which are more or less related to psychological needs. That means they want to essentially end up having a stable, employment, want to stay within the company, and as and when they grow and stay within the company for 2 years, 3 years, the person who has served the company for about 3 years might have a different need from a person who has actually been in the company for 5 years, somebody who's been in the company for 10 years, and somebody who's been in the company for 15 years. So HR needs to look at having some sort of a matrix which allows them to capture this within the performance appraisal, and bases the hierarchy of needs where they place the individual in, depending on how long they worked within the organization, the kind of role they do, and the kind of roles and responsibilities they have. They try and map it across to a pyramid, and this pyramid basically then helps them to provide, let's put it this way, the appropriate, basically they are able to then help them to kind of look at, let's put it this way, reorganizing some of the things when they are captured in the performance appraisal to try and set targets accordingly, or try and set bonus incentives and perks accordingly, so that they feel that they are being cared for and they are also being looked at from a point of view of being moving up into the organization. So to a certain extent, when we look at performance appraisal, it captures as an activity, it is quite important because it captures a lot of things. One, it captures, general feedback about their work environment. It captures feedback about, their line managers, how they perceive the people that they work with. Are they happy in general in terms of working when they work with different set of people? It helps them get some feedback in terms of qualitative factors on the structure and culture of the organization. To a certain extent, what are the motivation and needs for that individual to stay within the organization, and larger extent, understand, what are the key things in terms of gap areas which have been picked up in the appraisal, and then the training and development which can be done to make that employee stay within the organization, the role, contribute more, achieve targets, and to a certain extent be loyal to the organization. So all these things are studied, or you get you capture these inputs by doing the process of something called appraisals. Now, there are lots of questions, pre-questionnaires, feedbacks, and things like that, which you're asked to do, self-appraisals. And the idea of taking those inputs are to basically get data related to some of these factors which are important before a performance appraisal or a review is done on an annual basis. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. So what I'm going to do is just now quickly show you one or two things which I'm going to send across primarily, from a point of view of essentially understanding a few other terms which are related to this learning outcome. Now, there is one particular model I think at this stage that you need to be aware of, which is the Tuckman's team performance model. Now, this particular model is typically, in terms of knowledge, I would suggest that you need to be aware of this, is because within organizations, sometimes what will happen is, if you've been working within a company, or say, for example, if you pick up the example of NHS, you would see that people are given, or they work generally within teams. Now, when they are given certain objectives, the managers try and put together a team which they feel would consist of individuals which will work well, they understand each other well, they are able to contribute, and they are able to kind of help each other to be able to achieve the overall objective. Now, when we look at teams in general, this was a particular model which was proposed by, Dr. Bruce Tuckman, and he came up with these 5 stages of team formation. And these, with the 5th stage, essentially it's adjourning. So this was an addition probably in the, 80s, when the 5th stage came across, which was adjourning. That means the team is more or less functioning quite well, and, is well oiled. When I say well oiled, it's working well from a point of view of, most of the members are accustomed and, working well within the team. The forming stage essentially talks about when they try and put together a team, what happens is there's a lot of conflicts, there are a lot of disagreements which tend to happen, and here everybody is looking at their role in terms of why they've been picked up and, brought into this team. So their roles and responsibilities are unclear. So here, when you put people together to form a team, what will happen is they are going to be having a lot of question marks or areas which they are not sure about, and this is basically a stage wherein a bit of self-discovery happens to try and understand the aims and objectives of why they've been put together in a particular team. Now, once this has happened, so for example, a simple case would be in a class, or sometimes you get to see within organizations when you work, there's a new project which is coming up, the manager would call a meeting and they would say, okay, I want to put a team together which will work on this project, and I would want some volunteers. So basically some people raise the hand, and what they do is he then puts together, okay, he says I need 4 volunteers, 4 people raise their hand, and then he puts them together in that team to be able to start to look at that project. Now, the second stage is forming, and in that forming stage, what tends to happen is that people, when they are in that group, they try and understand each other's, capabilities. They try and understand, what their role is going to be, and they try and get them into positions, or try and understand and take positions that this is something that I will be able to do, this is something that you can do. And there's a bit of conflicts which tend to happen because there are disagreements essentially in this stage wherein, sometimes your manager will say, okay, 4 of you have come together, that's fine, I agree. Now, can you get together, discuss among yourself who's given is, they're given a task, and what they're asked to do is come up and figure out what role each individual will play within that team. And this is where, a lot of discussions, conflicts typically tend to happen, is that someone will come in and say, okay, I'll be the team leader, I'll do the presentation. Somebody will say, okay, I'm good at research, I'll do this. But then there are disagreements also, because sometimes people will say, okay, no, I want to be the team leader, or I can do this much better. And then, these kind of struggles or, discussions happen. And this stage is called storming before they arrive into something called the norming stage. So after a discussion, internal conflicts, whatever they've done, they've come to a stage wherein they've decided, okay, that, I know my skills, I know my strength, and everybody agrees that, okay, you be this, I'll do this, and I'll do that. And they come to a stage wherein they then tend to agree generally on their roles, what they can do within that group. Because at this stage, some sort of a sanity comes in, and they realize that the reason why they've come into the team or have been put together into a team is to accomplish a larger objective. And the idea there is then everybody goes through their SWOT or their strengths and weaknesses, and then conforms after discussions to a particular role that this is something which is going to be most appropriate for me to do, and I will be able to contribute more towards this activity while working within this team. And this stage then tends to be norming. So by this stage, the roles and responsibilities of the members of that team have become pretty much clear. That means they are in agreement with each other, and they understand what their role and responsibility is going to be, and they then tend to engage. That means they then tend to work as a group together to be able to work towards that objective. Now, the fourth stage is performing. Now, in that performing stage, what you tend to see is that individuals will not only work within their role, but they will also understand each other's role quite well and see where that role contributes to achieving the overall objective. Now, this is something which is quite clear, is because in this case, in this particular stage of performing, there are very few disagreements which tend to happen, because they understand their role quite well and how their role contributes to the overall objective of the team, for which they've been put together. And here they are able to have that rapport of working together, that, okay, I will complete this task from this stage to this stage, and I will then give it to you, and then you will take it forward to be able to bring it to completion. And there is a sense of understanding and belonging, and a relationship tends to build up between the team members, wherein they become dependent on each other, and to a certain extent are understanding of the requirements of the other individual's role within the team. And the last stage, which is not something which I've documented here, is basically now termed as the fifth stage. And that stage is something called, okay, I've documented that basically is called the adjourning stage. Now here, in this stage, what tends to happen is that after the team has gone through, forming, storming, forming, norming, and performing, they tend to be getting into a phase wherein sometimes the teams are dismantled. That means you've achieved the project, the objective has been done, and the team gets dismantled. So in the adjourning stage is basically the last stage, wherein obviously at some stage they will either bring in more people relevant to the group. That means they will bring more people into the group so that they can, as the responsibilities increase, they then tend to bring in individuals which will come in and contribute on. In some cases, sometimes you will see that because the project has been accomplished, or the task has been done, or the objective has been met, the teams are going to be disbanded. So that disbandment of team, or that process wherein either it leads to the second phase or an enlargement of the project, and in some cases, maybe to the closure of the process, wherein there's a bit of recognition which is done, what things were done good, awards are given out, incentives are given out, and things like that. Or the gap areas are understood so that when the next project and the next teams comes up as an opportunity, then in this case, retrospective, they have what you call the learnings, which were done with this particular project, and how these gap areas or learnings then could be avoided if a team of that type is to be put together to take up future projects. And this stage in that model is normally called the adjourning stage. So this is a handout which is important, because you should be aware of how teams are formed and what is the theoretical background in terms of the formation of teams within the organization. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That's great.
Yep. So this is one of the models. The other model is Belbin's model, and Belbin identified 14 different roles within the team. So somebody comes in, they come in, and I'll send you a bit of a handout for reading so that you're aware of it. But it is not very particular at this point to this particular unit, but we study unit 5.9. That is something which we will go through in a bit more detail. And here, instead of these 5 general roles, Dr. Meredith Belbin actually came up with the idea of further classifying those roles as performer, contributor, conflictor, harmonizer. So he gave certain terms to people when they are put together in teams, and what kind of role they play and what kind of position they assume, and because of which he coined some terms across the stage or across the team building model to come up with names which describe the roles of those individuals when they are put together in that team. So we look at that, when we come to, but this is a handout which I'll send you along with the, presentation today. And the last thing that we want to look at very briefly to understand what is CSR. I did mention, briefly when we looked at the, the activity which is CSR. Now, CSR has a very broad definition. When we say corporate social responsibility, could take many meanings, and in some cases, the journal acceptable definition of CSR with regards to organization is that, it basically talks about some sort of sustainable development which can happen within the organization. So when I say sustainable development, means that when we look at resources, there are finite resources, whether we look at physical, infrastructural, raw materials, things like that, there are always resources, and these resources are finite. So when we look at finite resources, the concept of CSR started to come in the early 1990s, is wherein all businesses try to approach, the utilization of these resources from a point of view of sustainability. And sustainability means that in some cases it has been, looked at from a definition of that how can we make this, work more or travel more in terms of, usage of the material. And in some cases, how this sustainability is linked to various stakeholders within the organization. Like a broad definition would be that when you look at different stakeholders, what are stakeholders? People who basically have some sort of a share or understanding within that organization, or they have some vested interest within that organization. And these shareholders or stakeholders would be shareholders who own the shares of the company. It could be employees, it could be suppliers, it could be, even the government could be a stakeholder. And in some cases, you will see that there are stakeholders which are primarily, let's put it this way, people who are not directly but indirectly linked to the business and business activities. Now, CSR defines that when we look at sustainable development, that development in terms of whatever the organization does actually need to contribute to the needs of all the various type of stakeholders in the organization. So a broad example, if I have to give you by looking at summarizing this, would be to understand, if I look at an organization which has, which is publicly listed, which has shares, then if you own the shares within a company, what is your vested interest that you want to see at the end of the year or the end of the financial year as a stakeholder, wherein you are a shareholder in particular for the company? Could you think of something in terms of what could be your vested interest as a shareholder?
No, at the moment.
Okay.
Sorry.
So if I have to say, for example, if you own shares within a company, say, for example, let's look at if you own shares within Tesco as a company, and you have 100 shares. Now, at the end of the day, what you've done is you've made an investment and bought these 100 shares because you want to get some return on investment. You want to get some, earnings per share or some dividends, as we call it, towards the end of the year. So it is in your vested interest to see Tesco performing well. And if they perform well, they make more profits, the share price does well. And because you're a shareholder, towards the end of the year, the company would declare something called a dividend. And that dividend would be kind of a return on investment in terms of money that you've invested in buying the shares. Correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Now, if I'm an employee, what would be the vested interest for me as an employee? Now, your vested interest as an employee would be that if the company is doing well, to a certain extent, it contributes to the overall well-being of you working within the organization. You might feel motivated, more proud that my company, I work for Tesco, and it's doing this and doing that. It's in the news. It could be from a financial aspect that you end up because you are able to achieve your targets. You are able to also get the bonus and incentive towards the end of the day. If the company does well, your vested interest is that your your salary and your incentives are guaranteed, and you might get a better working environment because the company is making a lot of profits and then reinvesting those profits into better offices, better infrastructure, and things like that. So for you, from an impact of an employee's perspective, your vested interest in that would be that I continue to get paid, my employment continues, and I get more pay, across the year, or in terms of a salary rise across the year as the company progresses well towards that. The suppliers and the other partners of the organization would want to see the firm prospering, which would mean if the business increases, they also get, more purchase orders or more orders to supply, material to that organization. So their vested interest is that as Tesco grows, their partners in terms of the businesses or the ancillary businesses from which it buys, increasing capacity would be that Tesco can buy more, and that would mean in turn their business will also increase. Now, where does the concept of CSR comes in? So when we look at stakeholders are looking at that you at some stage are also, from a customers are also stakeholders, because they are the ones which buy the products and services. To a certain extent, the customers also would feel that if the company is doing well, then the company also has enough money to be able to invest. And because they are able to invest and buy from different locations, maybe the prices at which they buy those products could be cheaper. Now, the role of the government over the years, what has happened is they have also become a stakeholder, and they have become a stakeholder from a point of view of legislation which gets introduced. So what is happening is, as some of these companies are growing, the businesses are growing, what the government as a stakeholder in the corporate social responsibility arena is doing is that they are putting in legislation into place which allows sustainable development of the environment. A simple example is when Tesco applies to get a license to open a big store in a particular city or a location, the government's vested interests are that it creates employment. The area that it develops obviously creates employments, but what they look at is that if you set up a store, then if you develop a particular area or a development, then the idea would be that you preserve the natural resources or the natural environment around that particular area, right? So they make huge car parks, they set up a huge store, but their key areas that they would put emphasis on would be that you need to look at putting in sustainable renewable resources. That means try and generate energy, try and recycle material, reduce the wastage which is going to landfill. And those areas are the areas which government as a stakeholder for that business would define that, okay, you have to meet these objectives, or CSR objectives as we call it, when you open a store within a location. And their objectives are, they want to promote employment, they want to reduce the wastage or landfills, the waste amount of waste going to the landfill. They want to conserve the environment, and these are objectives which they put in from their side as one of the stakeholders, which gives a license to the Tesco stores to be able to open a new store in a location. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does.
Yeah. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring in an approach of ethics and some sort of an approach in terms of accountability from the organization to follow an agenda which helps promote sustainable development. And that concept is called corporate social responsibility. And the department which is tasked with maintaining compliance with CSR is generally either the operations or the HR department from an organizational perspective. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So in general, when we look at who meets the compliance when it comes to rules and regulations, it could be either the finance department when we look at publishing. Why does the business need to publish annual reports in terms of balance sheets and profit and loss account? Because the company's house, and in the background, the government has placed a requirement on businesses to declare their financial statements. Those are then mandatory as an act under the Companies Law Act of 2006, wherein each company which is trading or basically involving in the business of trading or doing business in general has to publish and print annual statements, or which are called financial statements. So government in general has become a kind of a stakeholder wherein they prescribe through legislation what is required to be done. So in the case of CSR, that department normally tends to be operations or HR, and they tend to then kind of manage and comply with the legislation which is described in the corporate social responsibility, or by the government in terms of legislation and policies over the years. Okay.
Yeah.
So a broad understanding of this concept is required at this stage, and that is what I would send you a small one pager handout which will tend to define CSR in terms of its definition, what is the importance of CSR within the organization, and who are the key stakeholders which kind of come together to maintain this agenda of corporate social responsibility.
Okay.
Okay. Now, any questions on what we have covered so far?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay, good stuff. Now, let's look at very briefly, the assignment brief, for this particular unit, in terms of what you will have to look at and what you have to essentially cover. Now, if I look at the assignment brief, which has been given here, obviously you have the same set of tasks which are there in the, the unit specification sheet, which is this one here. But what they have done, as usual, as you know, in the assignment brief, what they do is in the Word document, they give you a slight bit of a scenario or a context to assume before you start answering these tasks. Now, I think in terms of doing some of the tasks is basically focusing on the command verb, which I've highlighted earlier in one of the feedbacks that I've given you in the assignment. So here it says explanation about how organizational structures impact on the people in organization. So my suggestion to you here would be to look at defining 3 or 4 types of structures: functional, hierarchical, matrix, divisional, and then maybe pick up one example to explain how this structure of the actually kind of relates to the organization in particular when you look at this task. So if you're picking up NHS as an example, NHS has a divisional structure, and in that case, what I would suggest is you explain this with regards to the breakage of the health secretary on top, then the CQC, and then basically underneath that you have the PCC or the trust PCCTs. And those trusts, 20 such trusts, which they manage 140 different hospitals, and the structure of the organization, then relies on these hospitals to provide the basic health and social care services within the communities, and they are pretty much independent, wherein the budgeting is then allocated through CQC and the healthcare ministry, but they tend to function more or less independently as far as the structure of the organization is concerned. And that would do your task 1. Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
fine.
task 2, you might want to pick up a specific example of how the culture of the organization is impacted depending on the structure. So when you look at divisional or hierarchical structures, what we do get to see is you pick up any of the 2 as examples and then explain that, in the hierarchical structure, what tends to happen is if you have any issues or any problems, they can only be sensitized to your line manager. The line manager goes to your department manager. The department manager then goes to, the head of, department or maybe the management. And because of the way the organization is structured here, it follows hierarchical structure. So the employees at the junior level might not have access to the senior management. And that would tend to have an impact on the organization, how the organization accomplishes objective. So here an example could be given to explain that context.
Yeah, I've done a 1 and 2. I'm on learning outcome 3 now.
Okay, that's great. So in the case of learning outcome 3, you're looking at, there are lots of motivational theories. So explain 1 or 2 theories and apply it to a particular organization.
Yeah, I've just started.
Simple example of sales, incentive bonuses, and how motivation, and use maybe the Maslow's model to explain that, okay, somebody at that level is looking at mostly financial security, then looking at other types of securities, and maybe explain one of that with the context to an organization.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of different uses of coaching and mentoring, in the presentation that I've given, there's a clear table which basically has differences between coaching and mentoring. So you could use that table in the assignment pretty much as a picture or as an image, and then explain the definition of coaching and explain the definition of mentoring, and maybe just maybe quote an example of your previous work experience, or maybe example wherein somebody has worked, say for example, somebody has been your coach or maybe a mentor, and that would do by explaining those objectives.
Yeah, that's fine. I've got that
Yeah.
all covered.
And the third task is, analysis of benefits of training and development. So here you have to talk about why organizations look at training and development. So basically looking at that presentation of job enrollment, job enlargement, job rotation, and, keeping the employees loyal, motivated. So here the idea would be to look at, training and development to cover the gap areas. And then these are the benefits which your organizations would have. So if you're looking at an example of the healthcare sector, in particular in NHS, health and safety trainings which are done by employees across the year are done because they want to keep them abreast of the standards, and also to keep them cutting edge in the to use, all in one day.
Yeah,
As
that's fine.
would be quoted as an example. Now in activity 4, it talks about review of people management strategies. So here you have to look at, the 3 things that we covered, how a review is put into place and why is it put into place. So management by objectives, balanced scorecard, or, appraisals in general. And these review strategies are done because they want the roles to be accountable. And, the review is done primarily to ensure that the targets set in the organization or objective sets are actually met. And today what we've done in activity 4 is directly related to the assessment of impact of how people management strategies are used. So you could use one strategy, which is just performance appraisal, and explain that and how it helps, achieve standards with the use of SMART goals.
Yeah.
Okay. And whatever example you pick up in this activity of an organization, you could just use that example to give a bit of recommendations of how this could improve performance, vis-a-vis in that organization. If this is done, these are set of recommendations that I would make, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that would basically just be the recommendations to improve the level of performance in that department or in that organization.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. Fine. Yep.
Brilliant. So let's look at starting an additional unit. I think what I'll do is I'm going to try and send out the invites today itself. To you, there are 4 in general, but I think only you have attended, but Shariful, Philip, and there's another student who's joined the course, which is Ali Raza, and I'm going to send out invites to you for the next unit, primarily for the next 4 weeks, just to have maybe to see if we can close another unit or go through another unit just before the Easter break, which is the 29th to the 30th of March.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That'd be great.
Good stuff. Thanks so much for joining in the session, Sadia, today, and then hopefully we'll catch up with you later in this week.
Okay. Thank you so much for today. We'll catch